welcome. I'm Kaya Schilde, the Center for the Study of Europe Director, and I am delighted today to welcome Professor Heba Gowayed, my colleague from Sociology. She is the, I have my notes here, the Moorman-Simon Assistant Professor of Sociology, and her research agenda is so exciting. It is global comparative study of low-income and vulnerable communities and their interactions with state and bureaucratic structures. She's here today to give her book talk on Refuge, How the State Shapes Human Potential. I have had my version pre-ordered for about 6 months, and it just arrived about a week ago. And I have not read it yet. I wanted to, but didn't. But
it'll be a preview.
Yes, exactly. I'm so excited. I skimmed it a little bit. It looks fantastic. It's a comparative study of the reception and the relative integration of Syrian refugees across multiple countries. So please join me in welcoming Professor Gowayed.
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. So I'm super excited. Folks have started getting the book, so I'm calling this like my soft opening, right? And it's my first in-person event at BU, so I'm really, really glad you all came, particularly my students who are in here, Matthew and folks from Sociology, and my friends. So I'm really glad that you are all here. So today I'm going to present on the book, which is called Refuge, How the State Shapes Human Potential. So today, the world is facing one of the largest displacement crises in modern history. And this is due to long-standing legacies of local violence produced by colonial legacies and newer facts of environmental degradation and the disappearance of land and resources. About 82.4 million people, more than about 1 in every 95 people, are currently forcibly displaced. And among them are 25 million people who are displaced outside of their country of origin. 6.7 million of those approximately are Syrian refugees. And in this presentation, I'm sharing with you the findings of a comparative ethnography that followed Syrian refugees as they began new lives in the United States, Canada, and Germany, countries that offered them resettlement and asylum, which the United Nations refers to as durable solutions to the problem of displacement. In this project, I focus on the experiences of refugees who are skilled or semi-skilled but not highly credentialed, and who arrived to each of these countries between 2015 and 2016. And I'm going to argue that human capital, typically examined as a crucial determinant of immigrant outcomes, is itself structured through state and corporation policies. Further, I show that this production is both racialized and gendered. Before I expand on this argument, however, let me give you a bit of background on how these men and women became refugees, which is also an explanation of their selection into each of the countries in this study. So the Syrian refugees in this study lived in cities like Homs, Syria's third largest, where this covered market once stood. They became refugees due to a war that began in 2011 as a result of the government's violent response to civil protests for social change, the Syrian manifestation of what became to be known regionally, right, as the Arab Spring. The war took with it the sights and sounds of the neighborhoods where their families had lived, the homes that they had built, and of course the lives of their loved ones. At first, refugees fled their homes to nearby areas, but eventually they fled the country. Most initially crossed into countries of immediate refuge, countries like Jordan, Lebanon, or Turkey, which continue to host about 83% of the world's refugees, right? The world's refugees typically don't leave any further than countries of immediate refuge. There, they would register with the United Nations Higher Council for Refugees. And this influx, of course, creates tension with local residents, resulting in targeting and exploitation of Syrians who did not have legal status in these countries of immediate refuge. So for instance, Lebanon is a country of just 6 million people, right, but took in about 1 million Syrian refugees. So for those who lived in these countries of immediate refuge but recognized that they did not find the kinds of lives that they wanted to have, right, didn't have legal status, didn't have access to jobs, there were two possible solutions. One was resettlement, and the other is asylum. And now resettlement is where a refugee is selected for travel to a third country. They're selected based on a vulnerability assessment, which is a measure of the family's financial burdens, things like the number of school-aged children, health conditions of family members, or violence or exploitation in countries of immediate refuge. Importantly, those who are offered resettlement in a given country can say yes or no, but cannot choose the destination country itself. Refugees are then vetted for travel through an arduous process that can take about 2 years. And the United States and Canada have long led the world on the number of people admitted through resettlement. each year, of course, with the caveat of the Trump administration. However, given the sheer number of refugees who are displaced globally, this is not actually a viable solution for the majority of those who are displaced. Only 1% of the world's refugees ever get resettled. So for those not offered resettlement, the other solution to displacement is asylum. I'm sure many of you remember in the summer of 2015, as almost 1 million people, with the help of smugglers, made the treacherous journey across the Aegean Sea and into Europe. As one Syrian woman, Walet, put it to me rhetorically, do you know what it is to go into debt to put your children in the arms of death? Asylum is where a refugee stakes his or her claim in a country that could offer them legal status by showing up and applying. Another example is what we're seeing people do from the Ukraine right now. By some estimates, Germany took in about 500,000 Syrian refugees between 2015 and 2016. Resettlement and asylum offer those who are seeking refuge an opportunity to rebuild their lives in well-equipped countries with legal status. But what do these institutional solutions mean for people who have experienced such traumatic displacement and who are embarking on new beginnings in strange countries? Today, we're going to look at resettlement and asylum not as ends to journeys, but as continuations to the process of seeking refuge. Indeed, by the time that the Syrian refugees in this study had arrived to the United States, Canada, and Germany, they had experienced a number of significant losses. They had lost their country, arriving to a new one where the adat wa taqalid, or norms and traditions, were entirely different, whose language was not their mother tongue, and where they would be ethnic, religious, and racial minorities associated to terrorism. They had resigned themselves to not seeing family for the foreseeable future. But what's more, they would experience a dimming of their potential. In these countries of resettlement and asylum, their skills or abilities or their human capital did not have the same resonance as they did in Syria. And the focus of this presentation is on why. The term human capital, central to studies in economics, as you know, refers to individual abilities and qualities that make workers productive. Sociologists have shown that human capital is an important determinant of immigrant socioeconomic mobility, alongside characteristics of a receiving context. And this is particularly true for first-generation immigrants. In other words, the literature shows that human capital and context together shape immigrant outcomes. Human capital in this literature is typically measured as years of education or occupational histories. It's something that people bring with them, an independent variable that's imagined to shape other outcomes. However, this leaves the question, if one had 5 years of Syrian public school education or held an occupation as an artisan in Syria, how does this actually matter for their productivity in a destination economy? This question has been of interest to economists who identify what they call the imperfect transferability of human capital for immigrants who are moving across disparate contexts. It has also been of interest to others who show that migration as a process is disruptive to human capital. Some have tried to explain this discrepancy, right? Human capital theorists look at it and say, it must be that immigrants just lack the necessary skills, right? Signaling theorists argue that this explanation doesn't make any sense because skills aren't a tangible object, right? It matters how they're understood, right? It matters what's legible to employers. Yet other theorists show that the reading of credentials is shaped by racism, or that the skills of minoritized groups are always seen as inferior. However, all of these explanations continue to treat the immigrant as a puzzle piece entering the labor market puzzle. But what of the state which governs the entire process of migration? So in this study, I introduce a theory of state-structured human capital. I argue, looking at this early period and through a comparative angle, that human capital is created, transformed, and destroyed through the incorporation policies of receiving countries, which derive from national approaches to social welfare. I find that incorporation systems can intervene in 2 different ways. First, they can recognize or ignore immigrant histories, seeing people as unskilled who may in fact have skills that could be activated. And this has always mattered for high-skilled immigrants, right? We've always thought about this when it comes to doctors or lawyers. But today I'm going to tell you the story of Amin, who drove a truck in Germany, who drove a truck in Syria. And I show that this history only matters if the German government recognizes it as mattering for the German labor market. Second, they can invest in newcomer refugee skills so that the refugee can translate their histories in ways that matter in a new setting or enable them to acquire new skills that matter in that setting. So for instance, states can provide language training classes or teach refugees a new skill in the receiving economy that they did not previously have. States can also provide financial assistance to allow people the time to adjust to the new context and activate the skills that they already carry. For these reasons, I argue that human capital is not only a determinant of immigrant outcomes, right, but it's also an outcome structured by state and corporation policies. And I show that human capital, or the production of human capital, is gendered. As scholars of gender have shown, institutions and services themselves feature gender expectations for who is a worker. These interact with Syrian refugee gender expectations, where men are often primary breadwinners, resulting in different, as I will show sometimes surprising outcomes for women and men. And the production of human capital is also racialized. Countries equip new arrivals in their pursuit of a good, stable life through the same racist social welfare systems that have long shaped the contours of national belonging. What's more, as scholars of race have shown, discrimination and racist violence diminishes people's possibilities, right? Here we see it both in the denial of opportunities to minoritized people and also through their fear of being in public space. So I'm going to show that it was particularly hard for women who wear the hijab to be out in public space and experience all the resources that were offered to them in these Western contexts. So now turning to a theory of immigrant reception, foundational literature in sociology holds that immigrant welcome is contingent on determinants including race, social capital, and legal status. The focus of this literature tends to be on long-term integration, or how immigrants fit into notions of some conception of a national whole. Instead, however, I join others who flip the question. I ask not how immigrants fit into a national whole, but how that whole works in the lives of immigrants, right? How countries shape the lives of immigrants. I focus on the understudied and crucial initial years in which newcomer histories collide with new systems to coalesce into their first designations of things like race and legal status and human capital, which are all socially constructed. This early period is crucial as it shapes immigrants' starting positions in new countries. I focus specifically on social welfare policies, which have long shaped the contours of national belonging. And finally, I compare refugees who, because they receive social assistance often denied other categories of immigrants, are kind of a conservative case to explore how these incorporation policies matter for new arrivals. Okay, so before I tell you how refugees are incorporated, let me briefly describe how they're admitted. So before refugees are incorporated through resettlement policies, the men and women in this study must be admitted with refugee status. In the United States and Canada, recognized refugees are resettled through long-time resettlement systems, and on your screen is the approximate number of people taken between 2015 and 2017. Germany has taken at least 500,000 refugees in the same period. And this was due to a temporary suspension of the Dublin regulation, which would have otherwise required everybody who was seeking refuge in the European Union to be on its periphery, right? Which is why you have a lot of people, for instance, in Greece, which I could talk about in the Q&A. Legally, in the United States and Canada, refugees have permanent residency within a year of their arrival. But in Germany, they receive a 1 to 3 year renewable residency depending on their level of protection, which is also a political decision. Okay, so what are the country's incorporation policies for refugees? Each derives, as I said before, from state welfare systems. So the United States, as you all know, is a liberal market economy that limits the role of the state. As one feature, the United States has a limited social service system because it treats poverty as an individual failure, as argued, for instance, by Michael Katz in The Undeserving Poor. In her work, Sibel Fox shows that this approach to poverty is inextricably linked to the disenfranchisement of Black Americans in the United States. Refugees' only regular cash assistance comes from TANF, the national welfare system offered to low-income people in the country. Introduced in '96, the program has lifetime limits and offers low amounts of cash assistance. The design matches the goal of both TANF and the 1980 Refugee Act, which is for self-sufficiency, or non-reliance on government assistance, right? The idea is that low-income people, refugees included, should not receive government benefits for any duration of time. Canada is also a liberal market economy, but characterized by what has been called inclusive liberalism. The social service system in Canada, deriving from this outlook, is generous, providing Canadians who need it with enough assistance to cover basic needs. This generosity shapes the Canadian government's proactive approach to immigrant integration, which is facilitated, really importantly, by more restrictive aspects of Canada's immigration policy, which again, I'm happy to address in the Q&A, right? Canada is not a race utopia, right? Let's just be very clear about that as we go through these slides, okay? As Irene Bloemrad shows, immigrants and refugees are received through state-sponsored multiculturalism. Canada actively recruits and seeks to integrate immigrants into the fabric of society by providing different kinds of resources like instrumental and symbolic assistance, including recognition and support of ethnic groups. And so it's with this express goal of integration in Canada that refugees are met. Finally, the German system is a corporatist system where the national economy is organized by coordination between the state, unions, and employers to the benefit of all three. The system includes high levels of expenditure on social programs and a highly centralized and powerful state that Meyer-Marx-Ferry describes as producing the nation. This nation was long comprised of ethnic Germans, as Germany has a long history of excluding non-Germanic people from full integration. Syrians entering the system benefit from generous financial assistance from the German state. However, it comes with conditions, right? And the first is to learn German. Then, to enter the labor market, which is a condition of their permanent residency, they need to gain German credentials, as do 85% of German workers. So as a result, I call the resettlement program in Germany one of credentialization. Okay, so how did the refugees experience these systems? Before I get to my data, let me briefly talk about my methods. So to compile the neat collection chart that you see on your screen involved an ethnography conducted over 3 countries over the span of 3 years. So I'm a fluent Arabic speaker, and in 2015, I was kicked out of my field site in Egypt, the long-term consequences of another dictatorial backlash against the Arab Spring. I was living in Connecticut when the United States government began to resettle Syrian refugees to a local agency there in 2015. I volunteered as an interpreter where I met about 18 families who I got to know closely in the coming years, observing firsthand meetings they had with the Department of Social Services, negotiations with off-the-books employers, and interactions with the resettlement agency. I recognized how important U.S. social services were to their story. Though they were living in a liberal city with strong social services compared to elsewhere in the United States, they had tremendous trepidation about their assistance and also about finding jobs. They were living under the constant threat of the quicksand of American poverty. I wondered how refugees' experiences in other countries were different. Just then, Justin Trudeau, who had run on a platform of resettling 25,000 refugees to Canada, won the premiership and was making good on his promise. Flights to Canada were inexpensive. I got to Toronto in February in time to see thousands of people crammed into hotels and motels and government buildings, trying to rent cars to go apartment searching in what was a brutally cold Canadian winter. There I include 5 families, 2 of whom are related to my families in New Haven, and all of whom were selected based on the same selection process as those in the United States, making them good comparative cases. While Canada has a private sponsorship program, I only include people selected via government sponsorship for the sake of comparability, though 2 of the families were part of a hybrid program, so I could talk a little bit about the intricacies of that. I visited Canada for a month initially, returning every 6 months for 2 weeks and maintaining contact with families using WhatsApp or social media in the interim. Finally, with the help of the National Science Foundation and the Horowitz Foundation, I included the case of Germany due to the sheer number of refugees admitted and because it is a welfare state with a very different kind of integration approach. In the summer of 2017, I included 5 families who were related to families elsewhere in my study. Because this part of the research would not be longitudinal, however, I returned in the summer of 2018 to conduct an additional 15 interviews, a sample of the University of Constance's National Survey on Refugees, which was just being launched at the time. And these interviews were conducted in Bavaria. Regarding the study sample, in all 3 of the countries, as you'll see in this presentation, and to remind you, I compare refugees from similar backgrounds, right? People who are carpenters, truck drivers, chefs, house painters, people who worked skilled and semi-skilled occupations but who lack the strong formal credentials. The women, for the most part, as I will also show, were not employed in Syria. However, in the German interviews, I did also have some highly skilled people, which I'm happy to talk about a little more in the Q&A about those differences. Okay, so now let's turn to what these refugees reveal about the incorporation policies across these 3 countries. So to organize my findings, in each case I describe how refugees experienced their arrival, the assistance they received from the state, and then I explore how each system structured their human capital and how that experience was different for women and for men. I begin with the case of the United States and how men and women adjusted to the self-sufficiency resettlement policy. Here I highlight the case of Roger and Majid, who just 7 years ago were a middle-class couple living in Homs, Syria, just around the corner from the covered market that I showed you all earlier. In 2010, they had finally achieved their dream of building their home, leaving the foundations in place to build additional floors for each of their 3 children, the oldest of whom was a preteen at the time. Their enjoyment of this dream, however, was short-lived. In 2011, they fled to Jordan, where Majid, who had owned his own restaurant, became an undocumented worker on a shawarma stand. The couple, along with their 3 children, arrived in JFK in October of 2015. An international organization for migration van drove them from JFK to New Haven, Connecticut. They were dropped off in a dimly lit parking lot of an off-track betting facility at the edge of town. They piled into the car of the resettlement agency caseworker and made their way to a low-income neighborhood of the post-industrial city. Their apartment was on the 2nd floor of what used to be a single-family home, and they would soon realize that it had a mouse infestation. There, the couple would be visited by a caseworker who would tell them what their assistance would be. During this meeting, they learned about TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, for the first time. They would receive $803 a month, the benefit for a family of 5. They would also receive a comparable amount in food stamps, though through an electronic benefit transfer that could only go towards food items. At this meeting, they also learned that their rent was $1,000 a month. Here is a budget of another family early in their resettlement. So because people don't read English, on the left is a clip art. On the left of your screen is a clip art of the expense. Each column header is a month, which this family then translated into their Arabic names. Yellow highlighter is welcome money, federal funding, which is $975 per refugee, right, a one-time payment. In the green is what the family is expected to pay. So as you can see, for the first 3 to 6 months, there's a little bit of support from the resettlement agency, which helped the family pay their rent using the welcome money, but also using other donations that came to the agency. However, already from month 2, the family was responsible for half of their rent, right? But when this assistance was up, TANF cash alone was insufficient to cover the rent. So somebody had to work. And in this family, there was no discussion as to who would work. It was Majid's responsibility, as he saw himself as the primary breadwinner. And this brings us to the issue of state-structured human capital. Majid lacked an effective social network. His friends were refugees who were just as poor as he was. However, through a contact at the mosque, he found a job with an Egyptian pizza store owner. He helped in the kitchen. Majid earned minimum wage at his job, and due to the nature of the job, however, he had no control over his shifts. Though he tried to attend English class, his work schedule was unpredictable. He also did not have the time or energy to study after his shift. Low-income work in the United States, as you all know, is defined by this precarity. It's shift work. It doesn't offer a living wage. It's defined by precarity and de-skilling. In Syria, the men were carpenters, electricians, contractors, chefs, and restaurant owners. When they met each other in the United States, they introduced themselves, listing these mihan or occupations. In the US, most worked low-wage jobs, dishwashers, janitors, gas station attendants, where coworkers did not speak English and where they did not have the energy or time to attend English classes after work. As one man put it, "I want to work, but I am new here. We just got here. We don't understand anything, but you want to push me to tfishuni to work. So we work whatever, hayallah. Most work in restaurants doing whatever. Everyone's working against their will. No one is happy. In other countries, they allow us to study, to get assistance. They say you're not allowed to work so you can learn. Not here." Meanwhile, after the kids enrolled in school, Rajet and the other women began to attend English classes in the morning. By staying out of the labor market, the women had the opportunity to build new human capital. The English they were learning enabled the women to do a series of tasks that their husbands could not. They could communicate with service providers and resettlement agency staff. They could advocate for their children in school, and they were building for the citizenship exam that they would take in 5 years' time. In addition, most of the women within a year of resettlement also took on some kind of income-earning task to support their husbands. The women utilized the skills that they had. For example, Rajette crocheted baby clothes and flower pins. And 26-year-old Reda, whose husband Zafar had said with finality, "Our wives don't work," did work. She prepared sweets, halawat al-laban and kunafa, that her husband sold to other co-ethnics. In this way, the women reimagined their existing human capital for new labor market returns. However, as I learned when I began the citizenship class with a group earlier this year, even for women, the gains are short-lived. None of these activities, because they were not earned with a pay stub, were recognized by the Department of Social Services in the United States as qualified work. The women could not receive limited federal child care subsidies to pursue them as a result. And as families settled in, babies were born. Sarah joked, "Donald Trump is trying to keep Syrians out of the country, but look at us, we're making more Syrians here." With nowhere, I know, this is good. With nowhere to leave their children, the women dropped out of English classes. Also, it's important to note, and I'm not sure if you can make this out on your screen, but also it's important to note that the women were also hindered in their pursuit of language as a result of anti-Muslim racism. On your screen is a message sent to the mosque in 2016. As hate crimes against Muslims spiked, including incidents against people in this study, they shied away from being outdoors on their own. Reda, for instance, stopped going to English class altogether after her family was attacked, and Rajette also stopped going for a period of time. 5 years after their arrival, none of the men and few of the women had enough English to qualify for the citizenship exam, a crucial barrier to inclusion and protection against policies like the travel ban that reduced their feeling of security in the United States. So in sum, the self-sufficiency imperative interacted with men and women's division of labor to result in men entering the labor market within months of their arrival, which reduced their ability to rebuild their human capital. Meanwhile, women, staying out of the labor market because their husbands had entered in their stead, were able to begin to learn more English and to reimagine their skills in new ways. But 5 years after their arrival, they too did not have much by way of language capital. My findings link to national data, which shows that though refugees enter the labor market quickly and are employed at higher rates than non-immigrants, they have lower incomes than the native-born and also than other immigrants, gaps that are increasing for new cohorts. Importantly, 20 years in, however, over half continue to have low English language proficiency. The experiences of refugee resettlement in the United States, therefore, is an integration into American poverty, which by design is populated by people of color and marked by stagnation. Okay, so what happens in Canada? A drive of 500 miles north of New Haven takes us to Toronto, where Denya, a relative of one of the families in New Haven, lived with her husband and 4 children. Denya has a laugh that can be heard ringing down the hallway of her apartment building. Her husband, Bassam, who is a bit older than her, owned his own restaurant in Homs like Majid did. The couple have one of their 4 children, include a son who requires a hearing aid, and who was placed in a school for the deaf in Canada, something that Denya was ecstatic about because he could finally get an education. When Bassam and Denya arrived, Costi, an organization that was managing their resettlement on behalf of the Canadian government, housed them in a hotel. They would be allowed, in contrast to refugees in the United States, to choose their own residence. They chose to move to Mississauga, an area with a large Arab community, where a market around the corner that sells the latest in Islamic fashion transplants the customer into an old town su'u. 2 other families in my study moved to Kitchener and Hamilton, with a group of other families starting a Syrian community out of the new arrivals in Toronto, people they did not previously know. The Canadian government gave families a startup allowance of $5,000 to cover the first and last month's rent. The government also provided new arrivals with standard issue furniture for their home. For the families resettled through private sponsors, the sponsors would find a home and furnish it for them at the same level. The family received a cash assistance of $1,600 a month, $800 per parent, in addition to the Canadian Child Benefit, or CCB, which is approximately $450 per school-aged child. After the first year, the families who still needed assistance would receive welfare, which was a few $100s less, but still supported the needs of the families. The Canadian government, as is clear on their website, anticipated this transition from cash assistance to welfare and didn't discourage it. So they write, when income support from the government, private sponsors ends after 12 months, In most cases, it is a normal occurrence for some refugees to transition to provincial or territorial social assistance support. Denya and Bassam's rent for a 3-bedroom apartment in this high-rise was $1,400 a month, which they would cover and exceed with this assistance. So the families did not need to follow the timeline of families in the United States. They could wait to enter the labor market. In fact, they were incentivized to do so because they would lose the refugee cash assistance if they entered the labor market prematurely. So this, of course, differentially structured their human capital. It allowed them to learn English and gain skills. Unlike in the United States, where men had to enter the labor market early and women were the only ones who could learn English, in Canada the opportunity was available to both women and men. Each morning, Bassam and Denya attend English classes, a short walk from their home. After a year of English classes, their English remained halting, but enabled them to have phone conversations, something that none of the families in New Haven could do. And while there was variation in the sample as to who attended English classes regularly, everyone reported that there were these opportunities for the classes as well as other educational opportunities. Courses through which they could gain additional skills or diplomas were free and readily available. However, the system was uneven in recognizing existing skills. So while a blacksmith in the study could find work immediately as a blacksmith, a woman who was a nurse in Syria and who had confronted the war as a nurse there could not gain equivalency, particularly because she'd lost some of her paperwork fleeing the war. She was told she'd need at least 5 years of schooling in Canada to become a nurse there. An electrician in the study was hired in an apprenticeship based on his existing credentials, but told he'd need to pass an exam to become a fully licensed electrician in the country. All three, however, and others in the study, benefited from publicly available free education. The blacksmith took courses on being a forklift operator in an attempt to reduce pain in his back. The engineer was considering earning a certificate in electrical engineering since he had to go back to school anyway. He figured he'd earn a higher credential. And the nurse began to be a community counselor, though she wasn't sure she could make a full career out of that. The existence of the classes benefited others too. Denya said in her usual jovial manner, Denya that just cooks and cleans is over, khalas. She was going to enroll in a class to learn to do hair. And Yasmin, who was almost the blacksmith's wife, did take classes in food prep and began to work at a restaurant. It's important to note that in Canada too, anti-Muslim racism existed, and hate crimes were almost as high, measured as in the United States. However, the families that I spoke to, in a sense, felt insulated from this hate. And I also did focus group discussions with other groups of families in Canada who also described feeling insulated. And even though ethnography or even focus groups is not the best measure of incidents, right? It's not the best measure of whether something happens. It's still telling because this was not the case in the people that I spoke to in the United States and Germany. So one explanation is that Syrians in Canada, unlike in the United States or Germany, had free mobility, right? They could choose to live near co-ethnics, and they could choose to live in cosmopolitan Toronto. Another is that, and what can't be discounted, is that Canada has an active policy of multiculturalism and inclusivity by law, which means that the state is focused on investing in people. And this is through the aforementioned language courses, but also through educational opportunities, radio programming in their languages, the existence of organizations that are ethnic organizations, and this too would probably help ballast this sense of belonging. So in sum, through investment, the Canadian government supported refugee expression of their human capital and gaining new human capital through language learning, though recognition, as I said, is inconsistent. We don't see it as strong of a divergence by gender as we do in the United States. A Syrian outcomes report found that among government-sponsored refugees who arrived in Canada in 2015, so this cohort, 43% found stable employment by 2018. However, this has a clear human capital trade-off. The same Canadian study shows that 7 in 10 of these same refugees attended English classes regularly, right? So job market was not great, but people were learning the language. Over 80% reported feeling that they could go shopping, go to their doctor's office, and interact in social situations entirely in English. Studies show that 15 years after their arrival, refugee income and labor market participation looks similar to that of other immigrants in Canada, and their English tends to be fluent. So in sum, the Canadian system, by creating opportunities for the expression of existing human capital and the creation of new human capital, leaves those seeking refuge feeling a stronger sense of financial security and belonging than their counterparts in the United States. All right, so what about Germany? So arrival in the German case of asylum, as I described before, is way more dangerous than arriving through resettlement. So Iman and her husband Amin, along with their 3 children, arrived in Germany in the summer of 2015. Amin was a long-haul truck driver in Damascus, where he was imprisoned due to tipping off the resistance on a delivery of ammunition. After he was released by the intervention of his boss, the family fled the country. First, they got to Turkey, and then a year later, they got on a raft to Greece. After an 18-day trek through Europe, including 3 days of detainment in Hungary, which Iman describes as the worst days of her life, even including the war, they arrived in Germany $400 in debt to someone who they had met along the way. They could not afford to travel further to their originally intended Sweden. After a welcoming arrival in Germany that brought Iman to tears, they spent 2 days in a police camp and then a month in a refugee camp in Leipzig, at which point they secured their 3-year temporary residency. Now, this was a very quick turnaround because typically this process takes a little bit longer than a year. Iman and Amin received assistance from the German government through the Jobs Center, where all unemployment and social assistance is distributed in Germany. Their rent in Dusseldorf was covered by the Jobs Center, and they received a monthly amount that covered their basic expenditures and allowed them to send a little bit of money home to their families every once in a while. Like in Canada, refugees' first concern was language learning by the German government. However, unlike in Ontario, Syrian refugees are required to attend German classes under a penalty of a reduction of their assistance. So Amin and Iman enrolled in class. In order to secure work in Germany, refugees would have to accomplish at least a B1 level of German. This meant succeeding in 4 courses, 3 A levels and the first of the B level, which would take a minimum of a year, but more realistically too, particularly if you didn't speak another language that used Latin letters or if you were illiterate in Arabic. The classes also taught basics about German culture and laws. But then, if Amin wanted to become a truck driver in Germany, he would need to do a training through an apprenticeship system called an Ausbildung for an additional 3 years. His experience as a truck driver and the fact that he had gotten arrested and tortured in prison as a result of his occupation was irrelevant. It wasn't seen by the German state as qualifying Amin to work. In order for Amin to find work in Germany, he would have to abide by the same rules as Germans. This made the Syrian refugees feel inadequate. As Odey, a 31-year-old former mechanic, said, the Germans see themselves here. If you want to be with us, then you have to catch up with us. When you get here, it's like you're a newborn. Another respondent was more explicit, calling the system racist and explaining, there's no recognition that I'm coming from Syria with an 11th grade education and that I want to continue to finish my education. Why can't I just continue on? It's racist. We left war to come here to be met by this racist system. For some, the lack of recognition of their professional history as human capital that matters for the German labor market resulted in giving up on securing equivalency. In Bavaria, for instance, BMW hired through temp agencies that did not require them to give workers contracts. But these hiring was super exploitative. The temp agencies took a cut of 50 cents for each hour that the men worked, and these jobs provided very little security and left Syrians uncredentialized vis-a-vis the German system. But for all, the main driver to enter the German economy through these good contracts was a fear that the German government would not renew their residencies unless the Syrians proved to be productive, right? They trusted Angela Merkel, but they were worried about who would come next after her, and we're going to see, whether their worries were in the right place in the coming years. For women, by contrast, the credentialization requirement cleared a pathway to the labor market. Yara, who had married her husband, a Palestinian refugee in Syria, when she was just 15 years old, said that she would not have continued her education or worked in Syria. Quote, I dropped out of school young, she told me. I wasn't a particularly good student and I got married young. In Syria, I would have taken care of our house and kids. In Germany, however, she said she wanted to become a dental assistant. And 3 years after arriving, she had already finished up her B1 and was in the process of applying for an Ausbildung. Similarly, Marwa, who arrived with her husband and 1 child and was pregnant with the second, knew that she would also enter the labor market. Of course, here you need two incomes, she said. shrugging when I asked her if she had discussed it with her husband. It was an obvious thing. However, here too it's important to outline the role of racism in shaping the experiences of new arrivals. The image of your screen is of hateful messages one woman received in her mailbox from her neighbor. Not only did new arrivals see the policies of the German state as exclusionary, or as one respondent put it, a German state that works well for the Germans, but they also felt that they were expected to relinquish parts of their identities to better fit notions of Leitkultur, or leading culture. In Germany, where Turks are a substantial minority, estimated to be 5% of the German population, the Syrians are racialized as Muslim in relation to this group, which is perceived to not want to assimilate. Particularly meaningful for the expression of human capital, women were turned away from jobs because they wore the hijab. So a 22-year-old woman was told by a government employee at the job center that she could not work in daycare while wearing her hijab because, quote, it would send a wrong message to the children. So in sum, in Germany, the system of credentialization ignored labor market histories and lengthened pathways to the labor market. There was a strong divergence by gender. The people with labor market histories, often men, were disadvantaged by non-recognition, and people without labor market histories, often women, but also younger folks, were advantaged by investment in credentialization because it was an important way to get to the labor market. However, an important caveat is the issue of discrimination, particularly anti-Muslim and anti-women racism that they experienced. 3 years into their asylum, 72% of Syrians remained unemployed, despite a need for them in the German labor market, where the unemployment rate at the time was about 4%. The erasure of skills and abilities through non-recognition is detrimental to asylees who have more to offer and who experience financial, political, and emotional injury by not being able to do so. But it also injures the German state, right? Which a lot of people think that the main reason that they took so many people is because of the low unemployment rate, right? So they also can't use this, these employable people who they've admitted. So this case emphasizes that in addition to the investment states make through incorporation policies, recognition is key to expressing existing human capital. In short, the presence of a German system for Germans leaves refugees feeling marginalized economically and otherwise. So to conclude, let's return to the main argument. So the global ethnography centers the experiences of men and women who come from similar socioeconomic backgrounds in their initial years in 3 countries of permanent refuge. In it, I advance a theory of state-structured human capital by showing that human capital, often conceptualized as a determinant of refugee outcomes, is instead a product of national incorporation policy, and specifically whether countries are willing to invest in and recognize refugee potential. In Germany, a diminished ability to use human capital is an outcome of a lack of recognition of immigrant histories as human capital. In the United States, a diminished ability to use pre-existing skills in the labor market is an outcome of a lack of investment in newly arrived refugees, so that they can use their skills and capacities productively in the economy. In Canada, investment in recognition results in an ability to use and create new human capital. These processes, as I have shown, are racialized and gendered because the welfare systems in each of these countries feature these inequalities. And refugees arrive to them as racialized minorities with their own expectations for men and women's labor. So what are the implications of this work? I will leave you with 3. So first, in accounts of refugee crises and in international laws, refugees are cast as victims, and receiving states that offer durable solutions are often cast as saviors. Implicit to this is the racist idea that life in the West is necessarily a privilege, and therefore countries are accomplishing their humanitarian commitment simply by admitting refugees. But admission into American poverty is no one's salvation. Indeed, wealthy countries that receive refugees, including the United States, Canada, and Germany, are complicit in the colonial legacies, foreign military interventions, environmental degradation that create the very conditions from which refugees are fleeing. And within their borders, they too are capable of violence. The violence of minoritizing, of denying living wages, of non-recognition of people's humanity. This project captures how countries equip new arrivals for their pursuit of a good, stable life through the very same systems that have long shaped the contours of national belonging and, of course, exclusion. Second and following, observing how the human capital of those seeking refuge is structured reveals the ways in which it matters well beyond the labor market. Language acquisition is necessary for everything from making friends to securing citizenship in all 3 of these countries. And the ability to express human capital is emotionally important. How would any of us feel if everything that we have accomplished personally and professionally was meaningless to everybody around us suddenly? Finally, this study has implications well beyond the case of refugees or even immigrants. Through the design that follows the simultaneous experience of people seeking refuge who are strangers to systems of social welfare, we raise a mirror to these systems themselves and how they shape inequality more broadly. The national and corporation systems that structure the human capital of refugees are the very same systems which low-income people have traversed across these 3 countries for decades, well before this cohort of Syrian refugees arrived. Thank you. All right, so I would love to take questions, but do you want to moderate, or should I?
I can moderate. I can help navigate. Go ahead, Nuda.
I don't want to dominate, because this was fantastic, and
thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gowayed. I mean, I've seen earlier. Do you want me to?
It's okay. I wanted paper, but that's right.
Yeah.
I don't actually need it. It's okay. There you go. Thank you. You want us always prepared. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is fascinating, and I feel like it's so crisp and usable. Your argument, at the minute you said it, it's just so clear. And I was thinking, like, how did I not know this? Of course this is true, but we don't know this, and it doesn't come up in the literature. And we really do think of human capital as an input instead of an output or an outcome. So I think I had a couple of kind of interrelated comments, and they all come down to the meso level of analysis of like civil society organizations, family networks, and kind of intermediaries between the state and individuals. And I think actually I was trying to think of like how this comes up in the research. And it came up in very specific examples. For one thing, I mean, your choice to interview families as opposed to individuals really not only shows gender differences when you're kind of controlling for all other factors, but also the way in which like family networks are part of, it's not just a story about individual migrants and states, right? These relationships are mediated by families. I know that you haven't, specifically to kind of keep the structured comparison clean, didn't look at the private sponsorship side of the Canadian program. Yeah, this is, so I guess like this is a long-winded way of saying how did like civil society or intermediaries come up in the research?
Sure, and that's a really important question. So, so I think that question is married to another question which I'm often asked, which is like how local contexts matter, right? And I think that both civil society and local contexts are a huge part of this story, right? But what I will say is that I think that the state-structured perspective, so this is a presentation about state-structured human capital. I could have done a presentation on state-structured social capital, right? Or a whole project. I mean, I didn't do that project, but I believe that the way in which states are sort of structuring the immigration process, how people arrive, the kinds of resources that they have access to, actually shapes what kinds of ethnic enclaves form, who is there, how you relate to your co-ethnics, right? So in this case, people have to take really shitty jobs. In the case of the United States, people have to take really shitty jobs working in gas stations for below minimum wage. Why do they have to take those jobs? Because those are jobs that are available to them without speaking English fluently. They're jobs that are available to them through their co-ethnic tie, but that co-ethnic tie also knows that they can exploit, you know, that they can exploit you. And so at the end of the day, you have a situation in which the whole system is structured by whether or not states are willing to invest, whether or not states are willing to recognize the humanity of people in their space, right? Being able to move, to live near co-ethnics, being able to, even the kinds of support that local civil society has, right? Is local civil society playing a role of constantly churning to fill a gap that the state leaves behind in its services, or is civil society really playing an enriching goal, right? I would argue that in the United States, the role of resettlement agencies is to fill a gap that the state leaves, whereas the role of non-governmental organizations in Canada is really to augment you know, what is already available through the state and through the social safety net. So I think that, you know, within the context of the state-structured sort of investment, you do have this variation in social capital, you have variation in how the organizations are working, you have variation in the kind of networks and the meanings of networks, right? So you're always connected to co-ethnics, but in what those relationships actually end up looking like from a relational perspective. The other thing that I did do, though, is I went back and with a graduate student of mine, Jake Watson, we did interviews Yeah, Jake. So we called all of the resettlement agencies that would speak to us in the United States. We have an N of about 40 out of like 100 and something that were operating at, or maybe, I don't know, Jake knows, but 170 something that were operating at the time. And we asked them about like, how do you think about self-sufficiency? What's your relationship like with civil society organizations? What kinds of services are you able to offer refugees who are arriving? And I think in that regard too, New Haven is kind of a conservative case because it's a well-funded agency in a well-funded city. Unfortunately, the case of the United States looks a lot where also we know that we have block funding for TANF and for the way that we distribute our social assistance. So unfortunately, the case of the United States that I present here is probably a better case than you would have, say, if you did this in Idaho.
Okay, I see nobody has their hand up, so I'm going to ask a follow-up.
There's a hand here. Yes,
okay,
please.
I missed it.
I can always ask a question. So I think this was absolutely terrific.
Thanks.
Okay. Second point is, I don't know if you're interested in studying maybe a few more families or broaden your study a bit and deepening it to more people, because maybe you'd have critics that say, oh, there's so few people, you don't really completely know what you're talking about. But the other side is, I mean, personally, I do a lot of policy work. I think it would be fabulous if you haven't already started to move into the policy area where you could tell agencies, especially in the U.S., how to improve, what needs to be done better. Now, probably there are a lot of people doing that, but you would hopefully have a better research base to rely on.
As to the first point, the critique of the method, it's kind of a, I have actually been saved from that critique because it's kind of a silly critique when you're looking at ethnography, right? I wouldn't have been able to, and I think people appreciate that, I wouldn't have been able to tell the story that I told had I done interviews or had I done a survey, right? Which is why we haven't told this story yet, right? So the ethnography, the method, which is longitudinal, which operates on a smaller end by default, given that you can't do, requires this kind. But it fills a gap between national level quantitative data and local level data, right? So it fills a really important gap between the data that we do have. And in terms of policy, I have been engaging in policy conversations. I mean, I just gave a webinar at Welcome America. I've been writing a lot of op-eds. And it's, the policy implications of this are there's a lot of different kinds of policy implications of this, but it's more of a sort of filling a broader conversation about like how we value people, right, at the very core. So I'm less of doing the individual, like here are the policies with which we can bridge this gap, and more of sort of engaging in the conversation of like what are the assumptions that we have and how are those revealed when we do the comparisons. Yes, please.
Have you spoken to any policy people about the dearth of public money they give? What did they say?
Yeah, so I spoke to people in Germany, and I've spoken to people in the United States. I spoke to people in Germany about the credentialization at the state level. I've spoken to people in the United States, people who are former, who sort of designed this policy, people at MDRC, and there's just no political will, right? I mean, this is the same. Excuse me?
Could you speak more slowly?
Absolutely, sure. I've been accused of that on many occasions, so it's not, I will 100%. So I've spoken to policy people, and the problem is that there's no political will, right? What we're talking about here is not a story, this is why I start with the social welfare policies, because this is not just a story of immigration or refugees arriving. This is a bigger story of an American approach to poverty. And if you start there, you recognize that, and this is why, I do write publicly, and I do care about a public audience, but at some level, we have to, in addition to the policy conversations, which I believe are hugely important, like what are individual, incremental, additive policies, I also believe that we need to have a conversation that's a little bit detached from that asks, what are we assuming about people? How is it that somebody can be a humanitarian case when they're in a refugee camp in Jordan, boards a flight, comes here and becomes a worker? A worker, right? Becomes a low-income worker. And how is it that our conception of this individual shifts so radically in the context of a single flight? Right? And so this is the kind of question that I'm interested in asking. and the kind of policy conversation I'm interested in having, though I can't tell you that I've gotten very far in changing the hearts and minds.
How do you respond? I mean, in public policy, people respond to your questions.
I mean, they feel like it's not realistic, right? I'm asking them to I'm asking for a revamping of welfare systems, right? It's not, to them, it's not realistic. I think people are willing to have the incremental conversation to say, invest in language classes. People can see the utility in that. Provide more benefits in the beginning. People can see the utility in that. I mean, they're clear. If I were asked to create a 5-step intervention, you know, that would be one thing, and people might have conversations at that level, but there isn't the political will. I mean, we literally came out of an administration that wanted to shut the program down altogether. So the conversations are happening with, you know, should we even admit people, let alone how we should treat them when we're here. So I'm writing the book for when they decide that, you know, this is a conversation they want to have. You know, that's the thing about books. They remain on bookshelves well after they're written. So hopefully someone will pick it up at some point. So I don't think a lot of immigrants come here and think this is great. There's a lot of data to the contrary.
Professor Laurie, because some of her recent work is on co-ethnics over time and actually shows that in comparative studies that it's not necessarily a welcoming co-ethnic situation, that often co-ethnics shut the door on, not always, right, but under certain conditions often how scarce the state policies are makes co-ethnics shut the door behind them sometimes, depending on the relative tensions of the
and those relationships can be very exploitative. I mean, you know, and even in the best of scenarios, even when people come here, they have the high, you know, they're highly credentialized, they enter a system that's designed for them. You know, the United States specifically selects on them. It's very difficult to be an immigrant in this country, and we have like a lot of data on that. So it's, I would say it's both constrained within the state systems, and positive experiences or experiences where people do well are, of course, you know, I believe in human agency, particularly for this group. You know, you have a group of people who literally rescued their families from a war, found their way all the way here. And so they are rock hard. They are people who are, you know, unlike they're a self-selected group, right? And so they're going to, you know, their pathways here, what I'm saying, people might be very successful, right? But it's despite these policies, not because of them, right? So this is what I'm saying here is to frame the policies. Okay, I saw Eric's hand up. And then back. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess my question is also a policy question and related to the European context. And so I mean, I guess sort of two parts there. One, you're saying that you're talking about the US context, but also in the European context, there really hasn't been a political will to change the ways in which people are received. And now we're experiencing a situation where, you know, the Ukrainian refugee exodus is sort of changing the picture a little bit. So as somebody who has done research on, you know, the reception of Syrian refugees in Germany, I guess what are your observations on how the reception is different? And particularly, you know, I saw a push notification from the New York Times today that said like European countries are specifically looking at ways to remove barriers for Ukrainian refugees to enter the labor force to, you know, fulfill these jobs that, you know, need to be fulfilled in these countries. So now there's a much more proactive approach. So it's sort of, you know, the system is there.
So for those of you in the room who don't know who this is Eric Reedy. He's the one who edited my new humanitarian piece that I sent to all my students. And so we've actually written about this together recently. But I would say that, so I've been thinking about this in two ways, actually. So the way that I wrote about it and the way that people have written about it, right, which is like the racially discrepant treatment, right, the way that borders are raced, the way that that the reception is raced, and that's how I've been thinking about it. But I'm actually working on a piece now, the piece I was texting you about earlier. I'm working on a piece now, which is to flip the question, to say what, you know, the way that Ukrainians are being received right now indicates that it was never ever a question of political, that it was never ever a question of state capacity. It was always a question of political will. And what can we imagine if we look at this and then we were to redesign our systems based on how these 3 million people were received, what can we imagine? Like, what can those systems possibly look like, right? And if we flip it that way, you know, what is it that how have we devalued people for so long, right? How have we just like dehumanized people for so long as part of the way in which we've designed these systems? And what are their possibilities? But now, with the case of Ukraine, we don't have to imagine those possibilities. We can point at them, right? Which is a completely different story than what we've been able to do before. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.
Amazing. I can see like how much investment you put on this research, and it's an inspirational story.
I can't wait to see yours. I'm like,
I have a question about, you say like this, how state is shaping the human capital is both gendered and racialized.
yes.
And when you're talking about the relational work between husbands and wives, and they don't even need to discuss whether like the woman will be in the like labor force. Do you think there's an additional layer for the gender part, like within the families, between how like between the wives and husbands, versus the racialized? Like when you say it's racialized, is it more like of an outward impact? Like did you see that like additional layer for the gender?
Yeah, so I would say it's intersectional, because the welfare system that they're interacting with is both racialized and gendered, right? And that's shaping in turn the gender relations within the household. So of course the gender relations, the partnership gender relations are themselves gendered, right? But because they exist within this racialized system, right, then we can't distinguish the experience of gender in the household away from the race system in which it exists.
Yeah, do you think it changed? To me, like it sounds, if it was super gendered back at their home, do you think it's a really quick change that husbands now accept that their wives could be in the...
It wasn't a quick change, but we have to think, so when we think about gender inequalities or gender relationships within households, right, they're always structured by state systems. So in Syria, you know, it's easy to think that in Syria they're structured by, you know, religion or by whatever, by culture, by anything like intrinsic, things that we think of as more intrinsic. But they're also structured by personal status laws. They're structured by labor markets. They're structured by they're structured by welfare policy. They're structured by all of these. They're always structured by all of those policies. So when you take the same family and you take them from one institutional setting and you put them in a different institutional setting, right, there's going to be residuals, right? There's going to be notions of how we did things, things taken for granted, ways in which people sort of existed and were, right? But at the same time, when you put them in a new institutional setting, you're putting them in deliberative cognition, right? To go to the literature on that. You're putting them in deliberative cognition where they have to decide what parts of that toolkit, of that cultural toolkit that they have at their disposal are salient and useful in this new setting in which they're thrust, right? And so you can't distinguish what's happening internally within families from the external institutional structure in which it exists, is how I'd respond to that. Yeah. Katie. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You had your question and then Katie, sorry. Oh, go ahead. Then follow up and then I'll transition. Sorry, I'm really bad at keeping the queue. I don't know why I volunteered to do this, but go ahead, Katie, and then, yeah.
I was also thinking of a similar question as Bahar's, which is it was clear how the state uses race and specifically is racist in terms of how it structures human capital in the 3 different sites. But could you say a little bit more about how the state itself uses gender to structure human capital and what's different across the 3 sites or similar?
Sure. So in the case of TANF in the United States, there's a very clear, I'm thinking about Ann Orloff's work here, but there's a very clear gender expectation within TANF funding. So one of the things is that care work does not count towards any kind of state benefit. Having, childcare is very much tied to working in the labor market, right? Showing hours of work in the labor market. There's other examples. There's the lack of, for instance, a robust child care support system, right? And all of these factors are going to be experienced differently for people who tend to do care work, which tend to be women, right, disproportionately than men. So as a result of it, in the confrontation of the system, which sees both the man and the women as workers and ignores care work as an existing thing, right, what you're going to have is sort of a gendered experience of the labor market, right, but also a gendered experience of resettlement and a gendered experience of who's able to do what with their time, just by virtue. So say, for instance, there was robust child care in the United States, right? It might be that the women would be able to enter the labor market at higher rates. I mean, I don't know, we don't have that counterfactual, right? In the case of Germany, for instance, because there is more child care assistance, and also because there's some leaves, like there's some care, assistance, like 3 years, for the first 3 years of a child's life, there's some care assistance. You see a different kind of system there, right? You see more women benefiting from the German classes. You also see more quick labor market entry for women than there would be than there is in the United States, right? And in Canada, you have somewhere in the middle because you do have these benefits, but they're not consistent. So the social welfare system and the social welfare provision has an expectation of the family unit and also of care work, and of mostly ignoring care work, that then shapes how people are able to sort of operate in that space. That's better. Okay. Thank you. Yes, I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
Could I ask 2 questions?
Of course.
Okay, one is a follow-up. I'm just kind of interested in what kind of, you said that you spoke to some policy entrepreneurs in a way, and how did they respond with specific policy difficulties in the changes you proposed? Except for the political will part, or the fact that there would have to be, for example, in the US, a kind of more social welfare approach, or the changes that it encompasses? Are there more practical policy difficulties?
Yeah, so I think that, 2 things. One is that, to have policy conversations, you're talking to a lot of people who are indirectly sort of in the policy sphere, right? So I didn't talk to the person who's like, I haven't talked to Biden, right? So I don't know. So, in terms of the power that this, in terms of the power of policymakers, so you're always suggesting, right? And seeing what the response is. In terms of, I'll tell you an example in terms of the German case. A lot of times policymakers want for it to look different. So in the German case, for instance, they've implemented all this recognition stuff to try to get people into the labor market, et cetera. But their systems work slowly, and they feel like, this is the way in which this whole entire system of Germany has been structured for such a long time, right? I mean, we're talking about the credential system in Germany, it's Bismarckian, right? It's like, it's functionalist, it starts in the late 1800s, right? It's a very specific kind of system, right? And so you want to change, so you're saying, these Syrians have arrived, and now I want you to revamp your whole country's system for these people who have arrived. Nobody's gonna listen to that, right? I'm using the case of Syrians in the United States to say, you need to revamp the whole welfare system. People have been saying this for years. I'm not the first person to say that they need to revamp the United States welfare system, and that it's counterintuitive and actually counterproductive for the reduction of poverty. I'm by far not the first person to say that, right? But that's the thing, is like when you're talking about these larger issues, there isn't a political will. So so that's what I mean when I say there isn't a political will in these policy conversations.
Yeah, in the back. Hi, my name is Hanya.
Hi,
Thank you so much for presenting today and for your work. I'm curious, kind of like piggybacking on that point, in sort of the European context, how does the supranational existence of like the EU affect the conversation? And if you compare it with like a place, I know like your study was only on Germany, but just from maybe like your background research on like a place like France, or a comparable, country within the EU, how does that like supranational governing force affect like what happens, and does it complicate it more, or with the existence of the state itself?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm just like, I have no idea what time, I just realized I have no idea what time it is. Okay, it's actually an excellent question, because the Dublin Regulation, which is a policy in the European Union, which requires for people who are arriving to the European Union to be fingerprinted and registered at their port of first entry, which tends to be in the European South, right? So what ends up happening there is that people cluster in Greece, Lampedusa, in what's the island out that I'm thinking by Spain? The Canary Islands, right? So that's where people go initially, right? And you see there these these masses of people that arrive there, and then they're denied access to the rest, right? But central to the Dublin regulation, which is, you know, I'm coming to your question, is the idea that so then you arrive in Southern Europe, and then you're basically allocated, theoretically, your process, and then you're allocated to different countries, right? Kind of like resettlement, okay? Sort of, I mean, I think they might actually call it resettlement, right? To different countries. Central to this is the imagination that it doesn't matter where you go, right?
Kind of like the federalist system, like in the US, very similar.
It doesn't matter where you go. That it's all the same shit, and that, you know, you go to wherever, they're going to give you the same kinds of systems. It doesn't matter where you go. Now, this neglects two things. One is whether people actually have three things. Whether people have ties, whether people speak a language that a destination country speaks, but also that fact that these receiving systems are highly, highly discrepant, right? The kinds of assistance that you're able to receive, when you can expect to enter the labor market, how the population is going to react to you, whether there are other co-ethnics there, like all the things that we've been discussing today are going to be highly discrepant by context. And so this is what you think about when you think about the European Union, right? Is that, you know, the European Union is not the United States in the same, it's not under a federal authority where there's, you know, some kind of designation of the kind of assistance that you receive. And as a result, it results in people feeling very lost in the European Union process because, for instance, I talked to a guy resettled to Romania. His family's in Germany, right? And he's older than 18, so he doesn't technically get to be resettled with them. So what does he do? He leaves, right, and leaves his legal status and tries to reapply for asylum, which is denied, right? He exists in camps for a long period of time. And this happens all the time. People being offered asylum in Greece, for instance, which is a huge issue. About 20, I think it was 30,000 people, maybe right before the summer, I read that it was about 20 to 30,000 people in Germany who had reapplied for asylum. I don't know if you remember this number, but had reapplied for asylum in Germany based on receiving asylum in Greece because Greece has zero assistance. I mean, they give people like 70 euros a month until they get asylum and they receive nothing, right? And so these are the kinds of systems that people contend with in the European Union. And it's a very interesting and very discrepant. I don't know what the laws are, particularly in France where you were asking, but it's a very interesting, very discrepant sort of geography of a system.
And the freedom of movement that like the European Union allows you is based on like basically citizenship.
So you can go. Limited. Yeah, you can go to France. So say, for instance, you get asylum in Greece. You can fly to Germany, which is what people are doing, but you don't have residency status in Germany. And so then you can go for a visit, but you can't go live there, right? And that's one of the actually discrepant things about the Ukraine is that they were offered residency status across the European Union for 3 years, right? No questions asked wherever they want to go. Unprecedented.
Thank you.
I have a question. If there aren't any more, I wanted to ask you.
Sure.
So I have an overtime question.
Yes.
I know that you're not like theorizing a big comparative historical thing.
Yes.
But I'm so curious about a couple things. Like, so in the U.S. case, like when you were talking, when you were giving note of the answer about like, you know, civil society interacting with the welfare state, the U.S. has varied over time. You know what I mean? So like there are kind of a couple different images here. One is like baked in 1619, you know, like racialized, you know, legal structures, and you know that you can trace it all the way back, right?
Yeah.
Another is variation over time with like there not being a golden age, let's say, but you know it becoming even more restrictive over time. You know, with like 1996 welfare reform, Reagan administration, deinstitutionalization, all these things. You know, where do you see critical junctures in the U.S. case? It's a two-part question. One's about the U.S., but I also have kind of the So like, where do you see the critical junctures here? Do you see them, or do you think it's more structural than that?
Yeah, I think there are critical junctures. I think that 96 is a good one because, you know, you have so for those of you who don't know, you get the personal responsibility and PRWOI, but it doesn't matter. But in 96, under the Clinton administration, which I very clearly tell my students because this is not a question of Republican or Democrat, everybody hates the poor. And so you know, and that fundamentally altered immigration protection because it changed the way, you know, who could receive social support, denied immigrants from the vast majority of social assistance, and also reduced TANF, or established TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, and said that you could only receive it for a given number of years, right? So if you're gonna be poor in America, make sure you're never poor longer than 5 years over the duration of your life, essentially is what it said, right? Now this is very, very different from what it was before. So welfare was never good, but people could receive it for longer periods of time, and there wasn't these lifetime limits on it, which meant that for somebody who arrived as a refugee, it gave you a longer sort of period. So a really good piece to read on this is Nazli Kibria's work, Family Tightrope, who's a professor as well in my department. And she wrote about refugees and about this like sort of longue durée experience of social assistance and how they worked it into their lives, and it's with Vietnamese refugees. The other way to think about this is that we didn't used to have a state program at all, right? It was entirely done by volunteers, right? That's why you have organizations like HIAS, organizations like Jewish Family Services, I'm thinking of the two, but organizations like International Rescue Committee, right? Like all of these, there's 9 VOLAGs, which are voluntary agencies, and those are born from the fact that we didn't have a refugee resettlement program, which is based in the United States on racist immigration laws, but also specifically anti-Semitism in the 1950s, and the relationship, the conflation of, the notion that Jewish people were involved in the Red Scare, right? That they were communists, right? And so therefore you have this very strong language in the text of, we don't want to accept Jewish refugees here, right? We call it the refugee problem, and it was based purely on anti-Semitism. And that's how the United States system was in the 1950s and 60s, and then you get sort of, the admission of Jewish refugees due to HIAS and due to lobbying in the 50s, and then more in the 60s, and then you don't get the Refugee Act until 1980, right? So of course there is a historical story here. I mean, I don't tell it. I mean, I refer to it in the book. But when we think about the securitization of refugees, when we think about both Democrats and Republicans are constantly obsessed with the idea of vetting, right? There's so much where they're like, oh, don't worry, guys, don't worry. Refugees are the most vetted category, and it's a defense of the vetting system, right? That's born in anti-Semitism, right? Because we don't get the refugee vetting until the 1950s because people are afraid of the admission of Jewish refugees in this country. And so this is a part of the history, of this. In Germany, you don't get, until the year 2000, the German official policy for immigration is Germany is not a country of immigration, like in their constitution. And so what does it mean to admit people in a country that has denied immigration for so long? Until the year 2000 as well, you could not become a citizen in Germany unless you had Germanic blood, right? And so these are all, and this is their whole definition of how they define sort of entry and inclusion into their country. And so there is definitely a historical story to be told here, for sure.
So I have the second part of my question,
yes.
And you anticipated it, which is perfect. So because I think my historical question dovetails with people's questions about where to orient policy or hope. You know what I mean? Like, where's the lever you can push to improve any of this? And so part of it is in how much is structure and how much could possibly change, right? And so I was thinking about your German case, about how progressive the state is in some ways, but how regressive society is, because those are the guilds that kind of police professions, right? It's extreme. It's not even just Bismarckian. It's medieval and it's anti-Semitic.
Yeah, it's also anti-Semitic.
Right.
There's a theme.
There's a theme. But then also U.S. history. It's not just about immigrants and anti-Semitism, but it's also about race and welfare.
Yeah.
And so where is those seem like superstructure sins kind of built in. Right?
Yeah. Oh, this is a story of superstructure sins. It's a story.
So I guess I want to open that to. I guess I don't really have a question other than to say, what makes Canada so special, and what can be learned?
So they're not, because it's also a superstructure sin there, because the reason why the investment in integration happens in Canada historically. So of course, historically in Canada also has national origin quotas, denies people based on their race, and we have the same system. They're basically run parallel to the United States until 1965. In 1965, you get the INA in the United States, right? And in Canada, you get a shift to say, okay, well, we're also not going to do national origin quotas, but instead, what we're going to do is we're going to admit people based on skill, right? We're going to admit people who have the skills for our economy. Now, very importantly, the conversation in the United States was also debating between skill and family reunification, right? So in both countries, they were having the same debate, right? The reason why Canada went with skill and the United States went with family reunification are both racist, okay? The United States went with family reunification because they thought that, well, in the United States, and I mean, I wish I had the graph with me, in the United States, the rate of admission of people who are non-white was extraordinarily low. I mean, because of the national origin quotas, there was almost, there were very, very few people here who weren't from Western Europe specifically, not even Eastern Europe, right? So the logic goes, well, if we have it by family reunification, then these people are just going to bring their families and we can keep it white, right? And in Canada, it was like, well, we want the best of the best, right? And the best of the best in that definition, in that context, in the context of that notion of merit, we're also going to be white, right? But what ended up happening in both cases is that people of color both had the merit, were coming through that system, and in the United States, everybody who was Western European who wanted to come had already come, right? So that's why you see the number of people of color just like skyrocket, right, from 1965 onward. Where was I going with this? I was answering your question, but but what ends up happening is that in Canada, because their system is based on this skill-based admission, right, and because they don't have family reunification, but also because they have three borders with a frigid water, and the other protected by the United States and by the Third Country Agreement, which means that they can send people back to the United States if they cross over. Canada has an extraordinarily restrictive immigration policy, extraordinarily restrictive. You cannot, even getting a visitor visa to Canada is super, super hard, right? So they don't have that much undocumented migration. And as a result, because they're so restrictive, and because the people they're getting are based on skill, of course they can afford to be lavish with them, right? Like, of course, because these people don't need welfare. So they don't have the notion in Canada that immigrants are coming to take our jobs, immigrants are coming to get on our welfare system, because for a large part, they've only let in people who are super highly skilled, right? They're only letting in doctors and lawyers. And so that's kind of a part of this story as well, is that the Canadian system is very racist and very restrictive, but it just in different ways. Yes?
So that's exactly what I was thinking about structured racism and how it has kind of shaped opinions about things. I'm from Greece, so I kind of have experienced this kind of mindset, oh, the immigrants are here to take our jobs, the immigrants are here to do this and to do that. And it's kind of a societal kind of problem in the mindset of people. So I was wondering if there is a way past this that people generally see, because even if we say that a state does implement some policies that are more accepting of immigrants, if something similar to Brexit happens and the people kind of revolt in quarter marks, how do we get past this kind of mindset?
So here's what I'll tell you. Brexit doesn't just happen, right? People's reaction to Greece, people's reaction to immigrants was not their original reaction. In Lesbos and on Samos and on Chios, initially the residents of those islands were the ones providing people with water, with shelter, with food, right? This is well documented, right? Political decision-making and the political sort of rejection and that kind of rhetoric is what creates Brexit, what creates the current Greek reaction to refugees, right? People are not inherently, it's not that people arrive and that people are immigrants in their country does not inherently cause people to revolt, right? Look at Ukraine, 3 million people arriving in Poland and Hungary who had literally just built a 325 million euro wall to keep others out. There are dead bodies littered all over those borders of people who are denied refuge and people who are denied movement, right? This is a political decision. It's more than just the presence of immigrants that causes it, right? It is a constructed fear. And so we can't start with Brexit, which is a reaction, but because that's not a reaction to the immigrants. That's a reaction to the political rhetoric that was built around the immigrants in order to garner political support.
Yes, but how does that political rhetoric kind of change? Because this has already happened and this has already shaped attitudes in a way. And I don't know if you saw that in the news with Ukrainian refugees. There were a lot of people talking about how the refugees were Christian, European-like, and why Europe was so accepting of them. So this kind of I don't know, it kind of indicates too, in a way, the us versus them mindset.
Sure. If I knew how to end racism, I would not be standing here talking to y'all. That's what I have to that. It's a good question, but I don't have the answer to it. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming.